Hi everyone, I hope you're all well and happy. My name's Jess, and I did chapter 10, Food Security. This chapter really interested me because I hope to maybe get involved in restorative agriculture, something of the sort. I'm a geology major, deal a lot with soils, so I found this one interesting. To begin, global food security is one of the greatest challenges of sustainable development due to continued increase of world population and environmental changes. We talked about Mathis in his warning of population growth, and that if we continued to grow at the rate we were, we would run out of food, and his prediction appears to be correct, except for there are a few other factors that he probably didn't even know. One is malnutrition. There's a large number of humans that suffer from malnourishment, which we'll talk about later. The second is continued population growth, with estimates saying that we increase by 75 million people every year. There's climate and environmental changes that threaten food production. Things like agriculture, which we'll get into. The food system itself contributing to climate and environmental changes. To begin, we talk about malnutrition, which impacts about 40% of the world's population. That's crazy. The first is undernourishment. This is a graph of an atlas of displaying the amount of malnourishment in the different regions of the world. You can see it's a lot of Africa, Asia, South America. There are about 900 million people either chronically malnourished or acutely malnourished. And this can cause things like disease and weakness to infection for their entire lives. The second issue that we face is micronutrient malnutrition, which is another name for hidden hunger. And that's just the inability to receive as many calories or proteins to survive that one might need. And this can lead to something called stunting or wasting. And I think the next slide here is just a depiction of what stunting and wasting might look like in a child. There's serious food insecurity in certain regions of the world, such as Africa, which we've discussed a lot in this book. One of the regions is the Horn of Africa, which is really dry and arid and hard to grow anything and support any kind of life. Here is a graph depicting the different regions in the Horn of Africa, and just how stressed these regions have been with famine and malnutrition. Hidden hunger is a serious problem in certain regions of the world. The next slide is an atlas displaying the hidden hunger index. Again, we see the trend of Africa being very bad. South America, Southeast Asia, and all of Asia, really. The third major issue that Sachs puts forth as part of malnutrition is obesity, which I didn't consider, but it's so true. which is the result of intaking more calories than necessary and not getting enough exercise. About 1 billion people suffer from obesity, and it's spreading from high-income countries to the middle-income countries. This next graph is an atlas depiction of the areas of the world suffering most from obesity. And you can see, again, the United States, Canada, Europe. This next slide is just what many nutritionists have put forth as the healthy eating pyramid, something that I'm sure many of us have seen since we were children. And just a good reminder of how we should be eating. Global food supply is also being destabilized by things like climate change. And with this shock comes an increase in food demand and then an increase in prices. Countries of rising income, like first world countries, United States and Europe, tend to be consuming more meat than they ever have before, which I found an interesting fact. And therefore, that amplifies the demand for food prices to go even higher due to the need for feed grains for cattle. The next slide is a depiction of the prices of food, major grain foods from 1977 to 2012. You can see that the food prices are falling after the first green revolution, where high-yield hardy seeds are developed and we are able to produce more food for our growing population. But then our population grows further and the price of food then goes up. This next slide is a depiction of Engel's law, which is the inverse relationship of total consumption per person and the share spent on food. And you can see with the wealthier nations just how much they spend on just other household expenditures versus how much they spend on food. And as the nations, we look at poorer and poorer nations, we see that each household ends up spending the majority of their incomes on just food and very little on household expenditures. And it's just a nice depiction of how drastically different our way of life can be from other places in the world, and just how we need to consider that, there are people living that way, worried about how they're going to get food. Agricultural land use is also a major issue, and it's used much for cropland and grazing. Humans use about 40% of the world's total land area for farming and grazing and meadows, which I had no idea about. That's crazy. Forests cover about 30% of the Earth's land area, and then another 30% is uninhabitable areas like mountains and deserts. Urban areas constitute for only about 3% of the world's land. One of the greatest challenges in food security is the enormous diversity in food systems of the world, knowing how to grow food in different areas. This can depend on climate, with temperature and rainfall. It can depend on soil quality, water availability, the availability for irrigation, topography, pests, biodiversity, and so on, transport costs. This next slide here is a depiction of just the global distribution of pasture land over the earth. And it's a lot. It's a lot of the earth is used for pasture and crops. This next slide is a depiction of the world's forests, which is another issue that we run into with agriculture. We also have to consider that they're removing forests to get this land. Most of these regions, like the regions, let's go back. The regions of North America and the temperate regions of Europe were once heavily forested, and now they're just, we can see, very heavily used for agriculture. So the continued removal of forests can also damage the environment in huge ways. This next slide, Sachs speaks of using different crops thrive in different ecologies. So we have to understand the environment and know how to grow the crops for that environment. And he uses Africa as an example. And this map is just Africa broken down by color and what crops they grow in these different regions. We can see that it's a lot of pasture land, grazing land, because it's very arid except for there with the rainforest. One thing that we have to consider as a major threat as well is climate change. High temperatures can reduce food productivity. Crops may not grow at all, they may fail, seeds may become infertile, soil moisture diminishes. In addition, precipitation patterns will change. Wetter places may get wetter, drier places will get drier. The way that we farm those areas will have to be completely reevaluated, or we might not even be able to. People living in these regions subjected to the impacts of climate change are obviously more likely to suffer from hunger and be forced to migrate. There'll be mass migrations. This will cause, turbulence, wars, unfortunately. Another important environmental practice that we need to get under control or agricultural practice, is the overuse of fresh water, the overuse of pesticides and herbicides, and just threatening biodiversity by deforestation and so on, draining of peatlands, sinks. One of the major things that Sachs discusses is the acidification of the oceans, which is really interesting. This next slide is a depiction of what increased acidification in the oceans can do to shellfish. From the top to the bottom, we see less and greater acidification. And you just see the shells get weaker and obviously less capable of protecting, less healthy. We use too much pesticides and herbicides, and we use them in the wrong way, and they run off into the water system and they evaporate into the air. This is a slide of the global pesticide use. And you can see the United States is crazy, and so is China. in that one country in South America, Argentina. Current agricultural practices threaten the environment primarily because the agricultural sector is the major emitter of GHGs, or greenhouse gases, which is carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. My notes. Agriculture is a major cause of this because of their excess use of nitrogen for fertilizer. They threaten biodiversity, or agriculture threatens biodiversity, as it's destructive to habitats and other species via deforestation, the use of pesticides and herbicides, as we discussed, and finally, the overuse of fresh water for crop irrigation. Here we have a slide depicting the different economic sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see the AFOLU is agriculture and forestry and other land use. And that's responsible for about 24% of the greenhouse gas emissions in our planet, which is pretty wild, considering it's not something like driving vehicles or airplanes or emitting pollution into the atmosphere via a factory. It's just farming. This next slide is just a depiction of the nitrogen cascade, which is basically how we use nitrogen directly and how it affects the different areas of our ecosystem and the different ways they affect it. Another very similar slide, just again the different types of greenhouse gases and how they affect the different areas of our ecosystem. I had mentioned briefly about the ocean acidification. That's another area heavily dominated by agriculture and our food, trying to get as much food as we can for our growing population. We overuse fertilizers, we put nitrogen on our soils, it runs off into the water system, into our oceans. It feeds the algae in the oceans, creating these massive blooms in different areas of the world, where then the algae dies, and the bacteria that consumes the algae also consume all the oxygen in the water, and then all the other marine life dies. This next slide is just an atlas depiction of what they call dead zones on our planet, which are areas where algae blooms have destroyed a lot of the marine life in the area. Maybe I should mention a little bit about just Haber and Bosch. They were just scientists that developed fertilizer back in like the early 1900s, 1910, I think, to help the ever-growing issue of famine and lack of food. And they developed fertilizer by removing nitrogen from the atmosphere and turning it into nitrogen that we can put on the soils. But it just is now messing with the nitrogen flux, and some farmers aren't as educated as others, and they don't in different areas of the world, they overuse these fertilizers and other pesticides and herbicides, and so part of the way of remedying this situation would just be educating public, educating farmers on how to farm more wisely. This next slide is Socks goes back to his business as usual, reference to just if like things continue the way we are continuing, we're gonna have some things, like some issues. This is just a slide depicting red boxes being the areas in which we have already exceeded the excess damage that we need to get under control. I don't know if that made any sense. And yellow is, you know, we're getting there, but you know, we can hopefully get that under control. Basically, the chapter ends with Sachs' suggestions on what we can do for the future for a more sustainable development involving our food. And first, we need to remember that each geographic region is different. And so we need to analyze each region specifically. It's not a one size fits all. And so this could be a very daunting task, just sending scientists and people to all over the world to help to teach farmers to grow and yield as many crops and have these crops be nutritious and still be able to feed our population and hopefully get the malnourishment issue under control that we already have. His first suggestion is we need to increase in productivity via plant breeding or advanced genetic modification. He talks about GMOs as not being necessarily a bad thing, which is not something that we hear. We hear so much that GMOs are bad, but I feel like some people don't even really know what exactly that means. Basically, it's science. We're using science to make a hardier form of seed that can grow in areas of drought or grow in areas with many pests, and still get a yield, get a product from it that's nutritious and can go to our populations. His second suggestion is more nutritious crops, again, via genetic modification, just getting more nutrients out of our crops. He uses the example of golden rice, which is rice that they are modifying to contain carotene and vitamin A, which will help significantly in the hidden hunger epidemic. He also suggests precision farming, which is very interesting. And that is basically analyzing the regions more closely, looking at their soils, what type of nutrients they need in those regions, what type of crops they can grow in those regions, the use of water and using water more wisely. That's actually his fourth suggestion is improved water management. He calls it more crop for the drought. Basically just managing our water better because we're running out of fresh water and some areas don't have it at all. And then his fifth suggestion would be better harvesting and storage and transport of crops. He goes on to say that roughly 30 to 40% of total food production is wasted due to things like rodents and pests, food rotting, physical loss of crops, and so on. Pretty wild. So if we can develop a way to save that 30 to 40%, that would be awesome. And finally, he just basically calls everyone to be more responsible for ourselves and our personal health. Those of us living in areas that struggle with obesity, we need to be more conscious of what we're eating and be aware that there are areas of the world that couldn't even fathom some of these things that we put in our bodies. But yeah, we just need to help each other. Anyway, thank you. I hope everyone has a great day.